I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, as promised, my conversation with independent journalist Tom Mutch, author of The Dogs of Mariupol, Russia's Invasion and the Forging of Ukraine's Iron Generation. The book is informed by Tom's on-the-ground reporting in Ukraine, and unlike many books chronicling the war, goes past the first year of the war. So there's more to this book than a lot of other Russia-Ukraine war books that have often focused more on the first year of the conflict rather than what has come since. Tom is a very interesting journalist. He's been willing to dialogue with Ukraine skeptics like Michael Tracy, and he provides a really nuanced view while also making an argument for supporting Ukraine's efforts as a just response to the Russian invasion. With that being said, he's also willing to point out the potential errors made by both Ukraine and the United States in the course of the war. And we're going to talk about all of that, including where Ukrainians have become frustrated with the US, especially during the years of the Biden administration. What comes next, who knows? But this conflict has been going on for some time, and I feel like now I need to talk about it more. And Tom's book is really nuanced and thoughtful, so I think it was a perfect time to have him on. The book is really great. I suggest you read it. And with all that being said, let's get right to it with Tom Mutch. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with. He's very open to speaking with all kinds of different people on the subject of the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm speaking with independent journalist Tom Mutch, author of The Dogs of Mariupol. How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on, JG.
So first off, maybe you could give a little bit of background into how you started covering this conflict.
Okay, so as I go through the whole thing in my book, what happened is originally, actually, I worked a bit as a journalist, but then I had a job briefly working effectively in the British Parliament. And as part of that, I helped to write a book, which was about British defense and security policy. And as part of that, my office did a trip to Ukraine back in 2018, back when the sort of frozen conflict in Donbass was going on. And after that, I just really liked being in the country. It's a beautiful country with a lot of very interesting stuff to see, great people. And I ended up going back there about once a year or so, just to sort of visit. So I originally actually started doing conflict reporting in Nagorno-Karabakh when the Armenia-Azerbaijan war broke out in 2020. I did a little bit of work in Afghanistan after that. But then when everyone like US intelligence and stuff started saying, oh, we think there's going to be an invasion of Ukraine, we're talking back now in January 2022, I was like, okay, I'm going to go there and I'm going to write a piece about, what's it like on the ground with the threat of war hanging over us. And then the war broke out about a month into my stay there, and I ended up staying, and I have been living in Ukraine more or less ever since, with a few substantial breaks since then.
And also, before we get into the meat and potatoes, maybe you could talk a little bit about the title of the book and why it's titled that.
Sure, sure. This is a question everyone seems very, very curious about. I know it's not a kind of standard that the war in Ukraine sort of title. Where it comes from is it comes from when that period of time I was in leading up to the full-scale invasion, when I was in Mariupol, which for listeners who might not know, Mariupol was is a port city on the southeast of Ukraine, part of the Donetsk region. It was one of Russia's major targets in the very start of the war. It was the sort of the first really important Russian victory. The Russian control was to take Mariupol. And I was there just before it broke out. And I remember one of the things we were doing is we were going around asking people like, oh, do you think there's going to be a war? Are there any preparations? Everyone was like, no, nothing's going to happen. Just politicians talk shit. I remember for one example, we went to a hospital and we asked them, this was like 10 days before it all kicked off. We asked them, hey, what's going on? Like, are you guys stocking up? Are you guys like, do you have any extra beds or any like, new medicine? And they're like, no. Also, what are you doing here? It's a Sunday. Like, we just want to chill out. And I was like, okay. But for whatever reason, the dogs in the city were going crazy. They were like constantly like barking at everyone, biting at everyone, barking and biting at each other. It was this really creepy kind of like rhythmic barking they just kept doing. And I couldn't get it out of my head. I remember I tweeted it at the time. Like, what it was like maybe the first thing I ever tweeted from Ukraine was, what's going on with the dogs in Mariupol. And that was just an image, especially because there's this sort of, spooky folklore tradition that says dogs bark when death is coming near something. Like, the owner of a dog will bark if he knows his owner is about to die, right? And so when Mariupol ended up being the site of one of probably the biggest hellish battle at the very start, that image was very, very clear in my mind. And I sort of put it down when the publisher asked for any ideas, and they really liked it. And I think it's quite catchy and it sticks, and it represents a lot of the themes of the book as well.
Yeah, I want to talk more about those themes. And I think it's interesting. One of the things you point out early in the book is that Ukrainians didn't really think much about Russia before this. I think you say that early on in the book, that they weren't as concerned with Russian politics in the way that Russia was concerned with Ukraine. Do you think that's telling in any way? Before
Yeah,
the
like
war. Yeah.
this is Yeah, because this is one thing that's very, very interesting, right? Is that Russian sort of ideology has portrayed Ukraine as this kind of great anti-Russia, where everyone is obsessed with destroying any legacy of Russian history or language or culture or anything like that. The truth is actually more mundane in that most people, like an example that I use in the book is Servant of the People, which is Volodymyr Zelensky's documentary, right? Series where he plays the president before he becomes the president in real life. Russia's barely an issue there at all. That I'm not sure of the war. I don't think the war in Donbass is mentioned really at all. What people were really concerned about, they were concerned with things like the economy, the standard of living, corruption in the government, and even, to be honest, when the sort of the war, the sort of kind of proxy war, or whatever you want to call it, was raging in Donbass between 2014 and 2022, like the war with the Russian, I don't know if you want to call them the proxies or the separatists or whatever, the sort of a war in Donbass, that really wasn't a concern for very many people's lives, right? Most people weren't thinking about that. They were just thinking about like how to live and how to get by, sort of day by day.
So now we're going to get into the real meat and potatoes. I want to talk about the initial shock of the invasion. When the invasion began, many Russians and Western observers believed Ukraine would collapse quickly. And you write in the book, I and most other foreigners there expected that Ukraine would maybe fall in even a few days. What, in your view, are the primary reasons Ukraine didn't fall? And why did so many, including Russia's own leadership, as you point out, and Western analysts, get it so wrong?
Okay, so this is a really good question. It's a really important one, and I'm glad that actually, as part of the research of the book, I got the chance to put this question directly to one of the top, Western analysts, whose name is Michael Kaufman, He was then at the Center for Naval Analysis. I believe he's now at the Carnegie Institute or Carnegie Endowment, or whatever you call it. And he basically said, there's a couple of reasons. There's okay, for one, people I think massively underestimated how good the Ukrainian army was and how prepared it was. Remember, one of the things about that war in Donbass that was really crucial to understanding how the rest of the war went is between 2014 and 2022, the entire Ukrainian army got this live fire training exercise that wasn't super dangerous, but it's where they could experience what actual warfare was like on the ground. So when you get to 2022, suddenly Ukraine has, even hundreds of thousands of soldiers who've cycled through, even if for only a couple of months at a time, and one thing we learned in this war is 1 month of battlefield experience is worth like 4 years at Sandhurst or West Point or any other academy like that. Battlefield experience means way more than, basically anything else. We can actually get into later why we found out that was the case, and it explains some of Ukraine's failings as well as its successes. Some of it was luck. Ukraine, apparently the invasion was supposed to take place either a week or a couple of days beforehand. The Ukrainian high command was still equivocating. At the very last, literally the day before the invasion, General Zaluzhny gave an order for Ukrainian troops to disperse weapons, armored vehicles, air defense, soldiers to disperse out of barracks and stuff like that. And so many of those places were targeted in the morning of the 24th of February. Now, if they had launched those a couple of days earlier while the Ukrainians are still equivocating, bang, you would have knocked out thousands and thousands of soldiers in the first day and possibly all of, Ukraine's ground-based air defense. So that they got really quite lucky there. But then there was the fact, and this is how the Russians structured the invasion, and this is what Michael Kaufman, kind of explained to me. He's like, look, when they said a special military operation, they were being serious. That wasn't a euphemism. That was really what they meant. And what they meant was that they were they still call it the SMO, kind of ridiculously, 3.5 years later, is that what they expected to do was they expected to deliver this very short, sharp shock that would, like, rather than trying to capture all those big cities, they were basically trying to isolate them. So to kind of, isolate Kyiv, probably capture, kill, do whatever with the Ukrainian political leadership in Kyiv itself, kind of do the same and surround Kharkiv, get to Odessa and cut Odessa. So they kind of wanted to sort of cut the country into these little like patchworks so that they would sort of paralyze Ukrainian command and control. They would cut civilian leadership off from, the rest of its forces. And crucially, what they really wanted to do is they really wanted to avoid a pitched battle with the bulk of the Ukrainian army that was in Donbass. And here's the thing about this, it nearly worked. It could have worked, right? If the Russians had succeeded in taking Hostomel airport intact and been able to land troops on the second or third day, that could have changed things. Luckily, the Ukrainian had like an artillery brigade in the area that was able to take them down. And so one of the problems is that as soon as Ukraine, and another thing that's actually quite interesting is that while we talk so much about how brutal the Russians are and the war crimes that have been committed, in those first few days, they actually had pretty strict rules of engagement. A lot of them were told not to fire unless fired upon. They were told to avoid any sort of damage to, civilian infrastructure or anything like that. This is what took in the first week or so. Once it became clear that this had failed, we started to get elsewhere. We started to get it started to go pear-shaped. But basically, these kind of and what ended up happening is that they invaded with this army that was, maybe about 150 to 200,000. They invaded literally by walking down the street in some points. In some points, they had like riot police ahead of like the airborne. They trundled their columns down these roads and these huge big cons because they expected to not really meet much resistance. They expected that they had collaborators in place who would sort of help them secure all the cities, and they just wanted to take over Ukraine like they had done with Crimea in 2014, bloodlessly and without a fight. Now, when it turned out that failed, Zelensky stayed in Kiev. The Ukrainian command and control got back online. They found ways to communicate. They found ways to sort of, disperse and avoid the Russian missile barrages. Russia was now assaulting a huge country with a smaller army than the Ukrainians actually put together themselves. And so that's why they got beaten back from Kyiv. That's why they got beaten back from Kharkiv. That's why they couldn't solidify their gains in like the sort of Odessa Mykolaiv Kherson theater. And that's why the only place they had really any appreciable success was down in the southeast, right? That land corridor to Donbass, which is still was been fought over heavily ever since. That was a bit of a ramble, but I think that gives you, definitely some food for thought.
I know your book deals with both sort of the triumphs and the errors made, but maybe we could talk about the what do you think were the early triumphs on Ukraine's end of things? Because I think there were some key decisions made that, you know, were very important early on in, keeping Ukraine afloat, because Ukraine did not fall, as you said. So what were the key decisions made? I mean, you said there was luck involved too, but what were the key decisions made that really kept Ukraine in the fight?
So the combination political and military decisions. So Zelensky's decision to disperse the Ukrainian armed forces the 1 and the 2 days before the initial invasion. Zelensky's decision to stay in Kiev. I think if he'd fled Kiev, even for Lviv or something, I think that would have had because one of the things that we know is that there were a lot of people even in Ukraine who were at the first few days who were on the fence, right? A lot of, and I don't want to name names here because I get in trouble, but a lot of like key decision makers in Ukraine in different cities disappeared for the first couple of days because they weren't sure which side to pick, and they didn't want to kind of come out, strongly super like in favor of the government if the government was going to collapse in a couple of days. Once it became clear that the initial invasion had failed, they found that they started coming out a lot more or in support of Ukraine. That's one thing I think that's going to be interesting to look at for historians down the line. The decision to destroy the airport in Hostomel, right? You know about Hostomel, where they flew in, they tried to fly in the cargo planes that were full of paratroopers and stuff to push into Kiev. Decision to destroy that. Decision to destroy the Irpin Bridge and flood the banks of the river so that they stop the approaching Russian armed forces. Another one, and this is two battles I don't think get nearly enough attention, is so the Russians when they invaded northern Ukraine, they invaded actually down several axes, not just Kiev, which everyone heard about, but also to Chernihiv and into Sumy as well. And so, for instance, there were all these. Now, Sumy is still a site of heavy fighting today, but the Russians would send these big columns kind of barreling past the city to go to Kiev, and basically a lot of guys in Sumy just sort of took up, that this was one of the places where they genuinely made Molotov cocktails and they, drive them and throw them at the convoys. And, they called it the gut punch, where they come up and constantly destroy that Russian logistics point. There was the battle in Chernihiv where the first tank brigade of Ukraine that was stationed there basically managed to hold off a Russian army that had about 10 times as many tanks or armor as it, just because of, intelligent positioning of their own artillery and of their own armored vehicles and stuff like that. And also, yeah, down in the south, there was the battle for Voznesiensk, which was Voznesiensk is this town. There's a really, really great little book. It's called A Small Stubborn Town. It's by a BBC journalist. It's only about 100 pages long. There's a really nice insight into how all of Ukrainian society, from the army, from the average human beings on the street. Pardon me, we had a power cut here. I'm in Barcelona, not in Kiev, so I don't know why that power's going off and on. But there you go. We had and it's how like all of the Ukrainian society came together, or the art came together with the army, with the local authorities, and they sort of got together and they made a lot of these sort of traps or put together a lot of their old weapons. Or another one was that became very important later was that there was like people who would do like hobby drone photography and stuff started flying their drones above the Russian columns so that you could see so that people could see and Ukrainians could target their artillery. So there was kind of there were morale factors, there were physical factors, there were the Russians' own limitations, but yeah, it just didn't work out, and now we are where we are 3 years later.
So I want to get back into some of the things I have in my notes here, but I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there's certain aspects of this war that haven't been covered very well, like certain battles. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about why those battles need more attention in terms of looking at it from a historical point of view.
So the battle in Chernihiv is, I think, the criminally understudied one. I did a bit of research myself. Like I have a short section about Chernihiv. I have a couple thousand words about Chernihiv, but because so basically Chernihiv is, for those people who don't know, it's about a 2.5 hour drive north of Kyiv. It's like there's the border sort of goes Belarus, Russia, and then Chernihiv. And if we all know that the Russians are sort of stopped in Irpin and Bucha and that they never got to Kiev that way. But if they'd been able to encircle Chernihiv and get down, they still could have gotten to Kiev, right? And the main city of Kiev wasn't particularly well defended. It didn't have good fortifications. It didn't have a lot of troops there. This is why, like, a lot of the Russians will say, well, the attack on Kiev was just a diversion. Like, no, it wasn't. There was no one to divert because there were barely any soldiers in Kiev, right? The Russians didn't really start making progress on their main war goals until they withdrew from Kiev and diverted those forces to Donbass. But yeah, that the Russians they outnumbered, as I said, the defenders of Chernihiv by about 3-1. They outnumbered them in armored vehicles by about 8 to 10 to 1. How the Ukrainians managed to save that city, I think, is one of the key battles of the war. Then there's some battles also in Donbass that have kind of been a bit forgotten about. So, for instance, everyone knows about Bakhmut, for instance, but I think people have forgotten about Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, because those were some of the major that was kind of when the Russians sort of perfected their kind of method of advance, which was basically destroy as much as you can with artillery to give the defenders no cover, and then just kind of slowly move your forces forward. And because, as I said at the start of the war, they spread themselves out way too thin. They attacked Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Kherson, Mariupol, Luhansk, and Donetsk, and rather sensibly. And sometimes I think the Russians, I don't want to say anything great about them, but they don't necessarily get enough credit in a military sense for when they realized that their tactics weren't working. They did often adapt eventually. And that's one of the big hinge points, for instance, the battles for Luhansk over the last Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, because that's when the Russians switched tactics from that kind of, sort of try and take everything at once to know we actually have to like mass our forces and give enough concentrated firepower to be able to break through in one place. And they did.
Well, this leads into an interesting point. I wanted to talk a little bit about how the war evolved from 2022 to 2025, and we really should break that down because I think it is evolved over the years in ways that are both strategic and emotional for the Ukrainian people. Can you speak to that?
Very, very much. Yeah. So a lot of people ask, okay, what's special about your book as opposed to other books? And look, there has been quite a few good books written. What mine has is about the last half to the last third, which covers a lot of stuff the other books, because they were written in the first year of the war, they only cover the first year, which is the kind of David and Goliath story of, Ukraine, the sort of like plucky underdog stands up to the aggressor. And that's not like an incorrect story. It does accurately reflect what happened in the first year of the war. The war in 2023, 2024, and 2025 is a very, very, very different looking conflict to what happened in 2022. And as I said, sometimes the Russians don't get like enough credit for the correct strategic and military decisions that they made. One of the things that I think people often don't realize is that the Ukrainian army actually, for a lot of the first part of the war, was actually slightly bigger than the Russian army, because the Russians were going entirely on like a peace that, theirs was effectively a giant police force until about the end of 2022, when they instituted partial mobilization for the first time and actually managed to bump their ranks up. It's when they started, Wagner started recruiting prisoners as well. It's when they started like massively raising their payment and bonus schemes so they could get more men into the army. It was a crude and often inefficient process, but it did work out in the long run. So, Ukraine in that first year, it had victory after victory. It had the kicked them out of Kyiv and Chernihiv. It, had the Kharkiv counteroffensive where it, absolutely smashed through Russian lines and took back that huge chunk of territory in Kharkiv and Donetsk. The Kherson counteroffensive where they sort of liberated the city up to the river. Like, I remember being in Kherson about 2 days after, and the Russians had been kicked out. And I remember Zelensky walking through, and we were at a press conference, and the journalist next to me asked him, like, do you think this is the beginning of the end? And he said, yes, I do think this is the beginning of the end. And that obviously is kind of taken from Churchill, where he's like, this isn't the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. And it was the end of the beginning, right? Because that first year was the beginning. The rest of the war has been the rest of the war. And the Russians have done, I don't want to say well, but they have definitely recovered from a lot of their early failures. They got more men into their army. People laughed at them, the Russians, for instance, for having to go, cap in hand to Kim Jong-un and make deals. Well, those deals presented them with millions of artillery shells and thousands of soldiers to use in Kursk. So it's like, yeah, you need to give some credit to where credit is due in that sense. And I think that's sometimes been one of the weaknesses of Western analysis, has been people don't want to appear like they're pro-Russian, so they're not willing to give Russia credit for correct military and strategic decisions that it took on the battlefield and in the political realm.
I also wanted to ask you, and I know I mentioned this in the notes, what were some of the acts of heroism on the part of Ukraine that you think stand out the most?
So when I think of these, I like to think of like individual examples of, because one of the things that really impressed me about Ukrainians in general was that a lot of very ordinary people were willing to put their lives sort of completely on the line. And the one that sticks out to me the most was when I was in Kherson. Do you remember in 2023 the flooding of the Dnipro River after the Kakhovka Dam was blown up? So the city of Kherson was basically completely flooded. It's about the middle chapter of my book. To be honest, it's my favorite chapter that I wrote, was about this city, Kherson. And it was absolutely wild. I remember it was like a 35-degree day. I was in like a singlet. I was on a little boat with a couple other journalists, and we were following, because what the Ukrainians were doing is the Ukrainian Special Boat Service. They were sending, because obviously the river had flooded. The Russians had just kind of cut and run from their part of the river, but there were tens of thousands of civilians over the other side that had been left to drown. And the Ukrainians were getting on speedboats, and they were going to the other side of the river, and they were evacuating those civilians and bringing them back to the safety of, free Ukrainian land, if that makes sense. And I just remember that was, because, that's a really dangerous, and they still did that. They continue to do that, because I remember I went back to Kherson the next year and I met them, and they're like, yeah, we still do this, every couple of weeks we go over, we have networks of, this is all in the book, and this is all clear for publication. We have networks of people who will help us find people who want to come back to Ukrainian land and bring them across the river. Yeah.
So I want to talk about the Battle of Bakhmut, but first, I was talking to a Ukrainian friend recently. I told them I was interviewing you, and they said they liked your work, but they were bothered by the fact that the book wasn't just a total triumphalist account. And what they said to me was, well, we can't say anything negative at this crucial time, this crucial juncture in the war. Now, they weren't like trying to attack you or anything, but I guess it was a concern for them. What would you say back to a person that is saying, well, if we don't approach this in total triumphalist terms, it could cost Ukraine in some way? What's your view on that criticism?
Well, look, for one, I am not a Ukrainian press officer, right? Like, that's not my job, right? And I think I've given a fairly pro-Ukrainian account in all of my... This is the thing, because I have, obviously, my personal beliefs. I do think they're morally in the right. But then I have to contrast that.
You cut out there for a second. You said, obviously, your personal beliefs, and then it cut out.
Yeah, so in some ways, my personal beliefs, sometimes conflict with the reality of who I am, as a reporter. Right? Because my personal beliefs is that Ukraine is a moral and just cause, and I wanted to win the war. My reporting and journalistic instincts are that Ukraine's done a lot right. It's also done an awful lot wrong. And again, these aren't necessarily moral judgments, but it is not my job to present a completely rosy and unvarnished version of Ukraine. My job is to record, as a journalist and now effectively as a historian in the book, to record the facts as accurately as I can and give them to other people so they can make up their own minds, right? And so it's like, that's just not my job, right? I'm not here to be a cheerleader. This book is not written to be like, hey, Ukraine is amazing and Slava Ukraini, do перемоги, like Ukraine is going to win everything, because let's be honest, it doesn't look like Ukraine is going to be in Crimea anytime soon, right? And you know, and it's like, well, you can say now is a crucial juncture. That's kind of true, but so is like every year, every month is kind of like a crucial juncture, right? Now, look, there is a little bit of like, there is one way in which I do kind of appreciate that they can say, well, look, so for instance, there are things that, I may have slightly pulled a punch on, like, issues, for instance, that I'm not that well versed in, like corruption in Ukraine, which is something that, I feel it's kind of for Ukrainian journalists to do because they know how it works and they know the systems. And I'm like, look, I'm not really involved in that, and it doesn't really affect my life. And I don't have the sources or the kind of inside knowledge that I'd need to really pursue that in a lot of detail. But I do touch on it in the book. I do touch on, corruption and military recruitment and how people, sometimes pay their way to get out of military service and stuff. So it's like, yeah, I'm at the end of the day, I'm a journalist and I'm a historian. I'm not a press officer for the Ukrainian armed forces.
Now, the Battle of Bakhmut, was it a strategic miscalculation? I think there's a big debate about that, and I think your book deals with it.
Yeah, so Bakhmut is a very, very interesting case because Bakhmut is where, so in the first year of the war, Ukrainian military and political strategy was very, very well aligned, right? Because the Ukrainian army was consistently advancing on the battlefield, and Ukraine was consistently at sort of the top of everyone's mind. And, most people in the world supported Ukraine, and most governments in Ukraine, for most, European governments, the United States, Ukraine was like the number one foreign policy thing, basically. And when we get into Bakhmut is where that political and military alignment starts to shift, right? Because, look, Bakhmut, after about January of 2023, becomes a death trap for Ukrainian soldiers, right? Bakhmut becomes a place where it was at first, it was what Zelensky called, the fortress of our morale. And I think that's an interesting phrase because it shows that the Ukrainian attempt to hold on to Bakhmut, like Bakhmut's in a valley, the Russians had the flanks surrounded. We couldn't go as journalists really any closer than Chasiv Yar at the time. Like a few managed to get in, but it was, and I went to the northern flank with the 80th Air Assault Brigade, but he was basically saying we're holding on to Bakhmut for reasons of political reasons, for reasons of morale, not because it actually makes military and strategic sense. And what ended up happening was that in Bakhmut, Ukraine bled out many of its best troops, right? For reasons that we don't quite understand. Zelensky wanted to hold. There was also, the thing where he went into the U.S. Congress and he sort of waved the flag that soldiers had signed in Bakhmut. He said, "This is our Saratoga. This is our main victory." And I think they kind of had this idea that they would break the Russian army on the flanks of Bakhmut, and then they would get in the counteroffensive and they would kind of take everything back. One of the problems is Bakhmut bled out a lot of the best and most experienced troops that were needed for that counteroffensive, right? It ran down ammunition stockpiles, it ran down experienced troops. And when the Ukrainians went on, and I cover this in chapter 9, chapter 6 is about Bakhmut, chapter 9 is about the counteroffensive, Ukraine really needed all those experienced troops because a lot of the troops that were attacking, yeah, they'd gone through the Western training courses, yeah, they had all the fancy equipment, but when the shells started falling, they didn't really know what they were doing.
Another aspect I wanted to talk about was how the West approached this whole conflict. And my sense is that the U.S. should have provided, you know, more weapons and aid early while simultaneously pushing Russia to negotiate rather than letting the war drag into a prolonged grinding conflict. I'm wondering, Do you share that critique, or do you think I'm off base with that?
No, I think that's generally pretty fair. So one of the problems that was happening in Ukraine is that, and this has drove Ukrainians absolutely up the wall, is the US would provide large quantities of equipment and weapons that would almost always arrive after they were needed, right? The one exception is HIMARS, like the sort of guided rocket systems. They arrived in about July, first started seeing major use in about July, August 2022. And they made a huge appreciable impact on the battlefield, and they helped Ukraine, especially take back Kherson, right? Then we had things like, for instance, there was that huge, big, nonsensical political argument in Germany. Oh, can we deal with the optics of seeing like Leopard tanks being used on the battlefields of Ukraine? Does that not like bring up echoes of the Nazis? And while they spent 3 or 4 months having that agonizing debate, the Russians built loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of fortifications, right? And so that when it came for those tanks to be used, they were already kind of obsolete. ATACMS, sort of long-range missiles, eventually being provided in 2024 when they really were needed in 2023. F-16s, now some of the problems for that is actually on Ukraine's end, because Ukraine didn't end up having, the right amount, enough qualified pilots, or for that matter, enough good English-speaking pilots to be able to train on F-16s. F-16s not being provided until 2024. Again, they were just needed a lot earlier. So Ukraine would eventually get, and the idea was always, oh, this would be uncontrollable escalation if we got that particular system. And at almost every point, the escalation kind of threshold was passed, and it never did anything. And the argument that people were making is, well, this could turn it into a nuclear war. Well, not really. And the reason that I argue that is that okay, so there's an escalation ladder of where Russia can go to like achieve its aims in Ukraine. And the very, very top is the use of nuclear weapons. They have a lot more steps on that ladder that they can go up before they get to the use of nukes, right? One of them is, for instance, declare war and fully mobilize, young men in Russia, like all of the hardcore right-wing war hawks within Russia have been calling for. That will be an escalation that you would hit far a lot. That's what you do before you use nuclear weapons, right? And so I think, and then this comes down to, and this is where I think a lot of the sort of Ukraine skeptics have a point. What was the US's real goal in the war in Ukraine? And we don't really know yet, and I don't know if we'll know for a while, whether they really wanted to help Ukraine win, or they just wanted to bleed out the Russian army on the battlefield.
Yeah, the way I put it, not to interrupt you, was sometimes I felt as if the Biden administration or Washington was more focused on bleeding out Russia, and maybe they weren't, but um, I could see why people would believe that. And then I think the other issue is, were we trying to ensure Ukraine's territorial integrity? I think that should have been the focus.
Here's the thing. That's why a lot of people in Ukraine like look back on the Biden administration in a very with a kind of a very negative viewpoint, because they were like, a lot of people in Ukraine do now think that they were kind of used by the US. The US would sort of calibrate so that they would have enough weaponry to stay in the fight, but never enough to like fully actually like win the fight. And especially as, again, I go over this point in my book, there's a big argument. Basically, if in mid 2022 the Americans had like rushed aid into Ukraine in time for the first Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was in 2022. By the way, that I think if there was ever a missed opportunity to like make peace in Ukraine, it wasn't the Istanbul talks. The Istanbul talks were, for a complicated bunch of reasons, the Istanbul talks in March 2022 were never going to get anywhere. I actually think if there'd been serious negotiations after Ukraine's victories in Kharkiv and Kherson, that would have been a much better time and place to end the war on. But again, we are where we are now. And I just think that if what the US aim was to like bleed the Russian army out and break Russia down, I think they failed. And I think they failed because Russia now has a bigger, better equipped, much more experienced armed forces in modern warfare than they had in 2022, basically. And one of the reasons is that so much of modern warfare has been developed on the battlefields of Ukraine, right? Modern warfare is now mainly fought with drones, with artillery and armored vehicles in a sort of a supporting role. Who are the most experienced armies in the world at modern warfare? Ukrainian and the Russian armies by a huge distance. I genuinely think, and this is where I think the real worry for people who say, oh, well, like, how does it affect like people outside of Ukraine? If Ukraine fell, which I don't think it will, but it's not outside the realms of possibility that the Russians capture all of Ukraine. This is an argument I'm slightly stealing from Timothy Snyder when he talks about the Nazis taking over Czechoslovakia in 1938, and they got like a really, really good army and a really, really good arms industry by sort of merging the Czech military industrial complex to the Nazi army. A Ukraine has such a good level of skill set, military industrial economy now that if the Russians were able to sort of merge those two armies, it would be a really, really, really unstoppable fighting force. And I think it would be the better by far than any continental army. Maybe the Poles would give it a run for its money, but I think genuinely, Ukraine and Russia combined, there's a 3-day special military operation to Berlin in there. I'm not even joking. Such is the distance between the capabilities in Russia and Ukraine and the capabilities in other NATO countries.
I'm really glad you brought up that point about that's been my criticism too, that I don't think the US had enough of an end game strategy in their support. There was a wishy-washiness there, even during Biden, and I think especially with Trump, there was sort of a wishy-washiness about, well, how much do we support? And it's like you're either all in and or you're not. And I think there should have been more of a strategy. So I agree with you on that. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that before I move on to the next question.
Well, I mean, if there was anything I wanted to add, it's that strategy backfired. And we see that, and the fact that, Russia is more dangerous now than it was in 2022, right?
Now, in terms of how this war ends, you had a very interesting conversation with Michael Tracy recently about how there needs to be an open discussion about how this war could wind down. Do you still see that space for discussion in light of Trump's recent comments, which indicate that there's really renewed U.S.-Russia tensions, and Trump is seemingly turning on Putin?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, Trump's expressed frustration before and it hasn't gone anywhere. So let's see how it goes now. So look, according to I don't want to say sources, but basically the sort of the vibes that I've picked up, like I do have fairly good contacts in Ukrainian officialdom, is that one of the things is that actually when Trump first came in, a lot of people did expect there to be an end to the war. And the reason for that is a lot of people were like, okay, Trump is a hard guy who is going to push Russia as far as he can. But there were two reasons that sort of initial diplomatic push failed. Number one reason, the US never really used its major leverage. Its major leverage is massive arms deliveries to Ukraine, which would require a heating up of the US industrial base, and massive secondary sanctions on anyone who sort of bought Russian oil, like China or India or places like that, which would have had knock-on effects with your US foreign policy in other affairs. But if you really want to punish the Russians, that's the way that you do it. Now, not only that, the Russians effectively, they'd still be mobilizing, plenty of tens of thousands of young men a month. They were still building a lot of drones. They were still bringing a lot of vehicles out of storage. They felt effectively that I think they had a kind of a punch, they still had a punch to throw. And they're like, there is no point sitting down at the negotiating table when we have enough resources to give it like one real more crack at the Ukrainian defensive lines to see if they crumble. I personally think it's more likely that, if the Russian summer offensive peters out or it doesn't really get anywhere, or maybe it only gets like one city like Pokrovsk or something, then I think, and the Trump administration is willing to actually go through with those sanctions, then I think we can have a serious conversation about an end to the war. And I like, if you want to like pin me down a personal prediction, I give it a year and a bit.
I also wanted to ask, with regards to how this war ends, I've known people on both the sort of pro-Ukraine side and the pro-Russia side that hold this view that nothing short of total victory for one side or the other is acceptable. And you do see that with the pro-Russian side, the sort of that podcast, Russians with Attitude. I've talked to Ukrainians who believe total victory is the only way forward. I don't think most wars necessarily end with total victory, though. A lot of wars end with negotiations. I mean, how do you see this ending? Is it going to be total victory or diplomacy that ends this?
So I think it's going to be, I'd say rather than diplomacy, I think it's more likely to be mutual exhaustion. I think it's more likely to be both sides kind of get sick of it. And I think that's showing signs of happening, right?
You said mutual what?
Exhaustion,
Okay.
mutual exhaustion. Um, the Russians aren't advancing very far for the amount of casualties they're taking. They're using up all their old Soviet stockpiles, whether it's ammunition or armored vehicles or whatever it is. At some point, I'm not really an economist, but economists I speak to say that within the next year or two, the current Russian economy is really going to kind of overheat and inflation's really going to hit up and stuff like that. And it has been hurting. It's just not been hurting as much as people think, and that it no longer becomes really in the Russian government's interest to carry on this war because they're not really getting anywhere that would justify the extraordinary amount of resources that they're using. So as I said, that's my prediction that the Russians are going to have like probably another 6 months of sustained offensive aggression where they try and take as much as possible, and then after that, I think they're depending on how far they get through. Look, I think there's still low probability scenarios where both sides get all the territory that they want, but I'm putting them both at under 20% these days. Like, and with Russians without attitude, for instance, they were like, yeah, no stopping until you get to Odessa, right? Like, I remember they once tweeted, it's like they were asked, how many Russian soldiers' deaths is it acceptable to get to Odessa? And they said, as many as it takes. Two things there. One, they've already retreated from from Kherson, which they would need to attack Odessa anyway. Two, if you're that keen, why are you not signing up to go to the front lines yourself to fight for the great Russian Odessa, whatever it is?
And I wanted to say on the opposite end of that, one of the arguments I've had with some of my Ukrainian friends is I mean, I hate to say this because I do think Ukrainians are fighting for territorial integrity. I mean, they're a country that's been invaded, and I can appreciate how Ukrainians feel about that and why they're fighting. I think that's just for them to fight for their territorial integrity. At the same time, I've been pretty adamant that I don't think they're going to get Crimea back. And I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Look, I don't know when you have those conversations with the Ukrainians because I think the view in general in Ukraine, especially over the last 6 months to a year, has sort of come around to accepting that if it
Okay.
happens, it will be
These
something.
conversations may have been 2 years ago, so.
Yeah, yeah. And remember, it's like one of the problems, one of the reasons you couldn't really negotiate at the end of 2022 is that Ukraine was still advancing. Ukraine still had a huge army. It was kind of on the yeah, one of the real difficulties with ending wars is that the best times to end wars in a military sense are often the worst times to end them politically, right? So it's like if Ukraine had negotiated at the end of 2022, start of 2023, before Bakhmut, before the counteroffensive failed, I think maybe it would have been a better chance. And maybe I'll piss off Ukrainians when I say this. It is sad that Ukraine will probably never get Donbass and Crimea back. Ukraine can live and survive as an economically viable sovereign state without those pieces of territory. Doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's just. This is what's happened to countries all throughout history. Countries have lost chunks of their territory. Like, Poland, for instance, came to terms with the loss of Lviv and those regions that are now part of Ukraine after the Second World War. Poland is a very strong, independent, viable state, right? Now the Hungary, for instance, has not really gotten over it, and that's why they would quite like a bite at the Ukrainian apple themselves in the Transcarpathia region. But it's like, okay, let's say the fighting stops where it is, or the Russians take a little bit more. You take another couple cities in Donetsk. Ukraine still has basically all the regional capitals that it started the full scale invasion with, right? Has Kharkiv, has Odessa, has Kherson, has Dnipro, has all of the big major industrial cities. It has lost half its coastline, but it can still export through Mykolaiv and Odessa. It's still, being cut off from the sea completely would have been a disaster. But it isn't, right? It still has half that coastline left, right? And so it's Ukraine will still survive as a fundamentally viable state. South Korea is a perfectly economically viable state, despite the Korean Peninsula being chopped in half, right? People will probably at some point have to learn to live with that.
Just a few more questions here. One of the reasons I contacted you was my audience on Russia Ukraine is probably even more split on this conflict than my listeners are on, say, like the Israel Hamas war and what's happening in Gaza. So I have like 50-50. I have 50% that are Ukraine skeptic and 50% that are just hardcore Ukraine supporters. And it can get difficult when you talk about any number of topics because these two camps just butt heads. And if you take sort of a nuanced view on any number of topics, people can get very angry. I had a Ukrainian friend that was very upset when I mentioned or talked about at any point Ukrainian far rightists. Now, I think that has been overstated by Russia. I do think there are, Banderite ideologues, maybe in like Western Ukraine, but I also think it's been overstated.
I'm happy to talk a bit about that, but I basically think it's a storm in a teacup that's like not really that relevant. Yeah, I just think it's not a very I just don't think it's that interesting. I'm happy to go into it if you want. That said, I am very curious to see what your audience will have to say about like what I've been saying today.
Well, we don't have to get into the all these debates about the Azov battalion or anything like that. I just wanted to, I guess what I wanted to get into is where do you see the two camps in the U.S. going wrong when talking about this conflict? So the Ukraine skeptics and the Ukraine supporters, is there any point where both are getting things wrong or both are getting things right?
So Ukraine supporters, where I fall into, one of the things is, as I said, is there has sometimes been an inability to sort of look at Ukraine and its problems and come to accept the fact that Zelensky hasn't done everything right, that Ukraine has made major miscalculations during the conflict. The fact that not everything that's gone wrong in Ukraine is the fault of the West not supporting Ukraine enough, right? That situations are generally more complicated than that. One of the things I found really, really strange, I have to say, about Ukraine skeptics in the US is that let's take like the MAGA movement in the US. Might even be controversial among Ukraine supporters about what I'm going to say. Ukraine is a conservative, pretty patriarchal, almost entirely Ukrainian white ethno state where everyone has guns and is defending their borders from foreign invaders. Isn't that sort of like the MAGA wet dream? Isn't that like what everyone in the right wing in America wants? Is like, a strong patriotic nation where everyone has a gun and is defending itself from invaders. And yet these people somehow hate Ukraine. That is one thing that I just don't understand for the life of me, right? One of the things that pisses me off to no end is when people are like, Zelensky has stolen all our money. And it's like, no, Zelensky took most of what the Ukrainians took. Like, I think there was this idea, and one of the dumbest things that I think Ukraine supporters in Congress or in the US administration did at the very start was be like, look, we're sending billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine. 60 billion, 120 billion, 300, whatever numbers, right? Those were obviously going to look bad years down the line. And because it's like, I think people have this idea, either way, I've got a little bit of extra time, so we can go a bit over if you've still got a few more questions. People got this idea that like Joe Biden was signing a check, Vladimir Zelensky, $60 billion. He's cashing it and he's going and buying supercars and he's buying yachts and hoped, like I remember I had one comment on one of my threads. It was like, Zelensky, he's really rich. He has 2 properties. And I'm like, 2 properties for like a major world leader with a really solid business career is really not that much evidence of extraordinary wealth. And a lot of what America gave Ukraine was NATO era semi-obsolete stockpile that wasn't ever going to be useful to the US. When the US gave, for instance, to Pickham's cluster munitions, 155 millimeter artillery shells, they're not really things that the US is going to need unless the US is expecting to be invaded from like Mexico or Canada, which these days, who knows? But yeah, that's one thing that I've always struggled with a lot of like Ukraine criticism in the US on the right is like I just don't see it having any basis in the realities on the ground.
I know you said the whole far right thing was a storm in a teacup, and I agree with you. I don't want to like spend too much time on it, but I am like perturbed that some people seem to think like Ukraine is just this giant Nazi state where everyone's a Nazi. It's
Yeah. So where it effectively comes from is that a lot of Ukrainians still lionize a lot of like the independence movements throughout their history. One of which was the sort of Bandera movement, or the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was around in the 1940s. I don't really want to go into it in a lot of details, but anyway, they were pretty shady guys. They did some pretty nasty stuff, especially to like the Polish and Jewish minority communities, right? That said, if we have to go and examine the sins of every leader who is lionized in a particular country, like the American founding fathers, it's like did plenty of shady stuff, right? Like, mostly, well, they were mostly all slave owners. It's like, just because you have a few uncomfortable or problematic statues, right? Also, are these not the exact same people who are complaining about Bandera statues in Lviv are the people who are complaining we shouldn't be taking down Confederate statues in the US, right? Because of like freedom of speech and respect for our history and traditions. And it's like this is why the right-wing criticism of Ukraine annoys me so much. Because if you look at Ukraine using their own terms of reference for the US, it will come out really, really well. So why do you right wing in the US is opposed to Ukraine is something I just don't understand. Other than partisan political politics. Now, yes, there was the Azov movement, which in 2014 did have a pretty dodgy history, right? It was, yes, it had open neo-Nazis as part of that battalion, and it didn't care, and it used Nazi symbols and stuff like that. Yes, that was true. The Ukrainians then took the Azov battalion. This is the part that was really controversial, even though it should have been. The Ukrainians then incorporated Azov into the official Ukrainian armed forces, which sounds bad on the face of it, but that's literally exactly what State Building 101 is. Conflict resolution, State Building 101, is you take armed irregular militias and you take them under state control so the state has the monopoly on the use of violence. Like, that's State Building 101, right? And so when people are like, "Yo, Ukrainians are all Nazis," it's like, well, they have a Jewish president. And, it's like, also, here's one of the really weird things. Okay, like, you do still see Nazi symbols in Ukraine. It is true. I was in a place, I won't say where once, where it had like loads of patches, right? I'll just never forget that there was like a patch that had like those SS symbols on it, and like just literally below it was an Israeli patch for Star of David. Yeah, that's the other really weird thing. Azov are probably like some of the most pro-Israel people, and that's a story for another day that I've ever met in my life, right? So yeah, I just don't think it holds up.
I gotta ask, Nagorno-Karabakh, why was there a whole section on Nagorno-Karabakh in the book? Because I was very interested in what was happening in Nagorno-Karabakh and when everything went down a year or so ago. How does that relate to all of this, I guess?
Sure. So, because in some ways it's completely separate. In some ways it has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. Completely different causes, completely different outcomes, completely different moral structure. However, in some ways, some of the themes are kind of the Ukraine were kind of illuminated there. So, also one, Nagorno-Karabakh has it's where I started my reporting career, and so I wanted to include a little bit of that in there just to give you kind of a sense of how wars in the 21st century look outside. So one, it was the first war where drones became the major factor on the battlefield, right? The reason Azerbaijan was able to take Armenian defenses out was that it just did drone warfare much, much better. It invested much better in newer technologies. The Armenians had old Soviet era stockpile kit. It wasn't good enough. It all got smashed. Basically, the story of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war in a couple sentences. Also, I think it did illustrate how much Russian power and prestige in the rest of the world have been eroded by their failures in Ukraine, right? Because, basically, the reason the war stopped in 2020 was that the Russians put their foot down and were like, no more. We're coming to like a diplomatic agreement or a settlement on this, right? Like, ironically enough, I once went into Azerbaijan with Russian peacekeepers, right? I've done this online, that's no some secret. But I went in like because and at that time the Russians were genuinely respected as the regional power who people were listening to and taken seriously. 2023 comes along, and Azerbaijan just knew the Russians are not going to stop us. They're not going to care. We can go in and do what we want.
Okay, I just wanted to ask. I also wanted to ask how Gaza fits into the picture. And
Yeah.
I appreciate your work on talking about Israel because you're not just. I think you've been critical.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to be critical of. So one, I want to preface this by saying I consider myself an expert on Ukraine. I do not at all consider myself an expert on Israel, Gaza, Palestine, the Middle East, whatever. I spent about 3 months living between Tel Aviv and Ramallah, so I do have I have an understanding of the issues. Okay, one, how it fit in. I think one thing that the war in Gaza really did was it not only did it distract the spotlight from Ukraine, it, for no fault of Ukraine's, it took away a large amount of the moral credibility underpinning Ukraine's case, right? Because the US, very justifiably so, was saying, Ukraine has sovereignty, territorial integrity, international law, human rights on their side, right? And so it was kind of something that everyone could kind of get behind. And then Gaza comes. And October the 7th was absolutely horrible. I have no doubt about that. And I understood exactly why the Israelis were doing what they were doing at first. And then it just went on and on and on. And they just, killed more people using the most, ridiculous justifications at different points in time. And it's like, and then the US is still getting behind them and being like, no, both Israel and Ukraine are like following international law, and Ukraine was, but Israel pretty clearly wasn't in a large number of places, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, right? In Syria now, right? What, it's like, how do you defend, for instance, Israel just bombing Syria in the way it's been doing in the last couple of days, right? That's Israelis bombing the center of Damascus is as in breach of international law as the Russians bombing the center of Kyiv, right? Like that's just how international law works. And and they're even using the same sort of justifications as Russians were like, oh, there's a genocide of ethnic Donbass, as the Israelis are like, oh, well, there's a genocide of Druze in that's why we have to like bomb them, right? And so I thought that it took the shine off the moral case that the West was making for Ukraine, right? And that's, I think, one of the sad lessons about what happened in Gaza. The fact that it's in my book briefly as kind of another one of the hinges, because the hinge goes from Ukraine's great moral victories to Ukraine kind of messing up and losing the war over about 2023. And at the same time, the West's kind of position as the sort of undisputed moral arbiter in the world is really badly tarnished by atrocities in Gaza that happens in 2023, starts happening in 2023 as well.
I know I have to let you get going, but if I do have those listeners that are Ukraine skeptics, what do you want to say to them in these like final moments of the conversation?
What I would say is, I think a little bit what I said about, the Western, Ukraine MAGA skeptics, for instance, is that like, one of the things that often annoys me is that people who are like mainstream Ukraine skeptics, I want to talk about like, people that are often on like right-wing TV shows, like, I don't know, like John Mearsheimer or Stephen, I think Cohen or Douglas McGregor or whatever. None of them have been to Ukraine in like at least decades. None of them are aware of like what Ukrainians actually think on the ground. Their ideas of what's going on in Ukraine are dated a long way, and also they've been consistently wrong on a lot of their predictions the whole time. Most of them expected Ukraine to collapse, and then in the first days, and then they expected Ukraine to collapse in the first weeks of the war. That's kind of, by the way, why I wanted to have a discussion with Michael Tracy, because I disagree with him on this issue quite strongly. But I did want to be like, look, I want to make my case to these kind of people. So, by the way, if you by any chance are a Ukraine skeptic and you have a podcast and you want to talk to me about this, I'm happy to, because I think one of the things we came back to is that one of the things that Ukraine proponents didn't do very well is we didn't really engage with Ukraine skeptical arguments, right? I think that was a big failing. that a lot of us have to take some responsibility for, and that's what I'm sort of trying to do now. Is like I'm willing to say I'll be your guy who will defend Ukraine while also doing it in a sort of a subtle and nuanced position that I'm not going to kind of give you propaganda or bullshit. Maybe you think I will, but I'm still happy to have those kind of conversations.
I know. I'm sorry, I'm keeping this going. I'm not trying to, but
I've got a bit more.
the,
Fine.
I think this is important. Is I know there's the figures on the right. You mentioned people like McGregor that say that are Ukraine skeptics. I think there's also a sort of small but vocal element of the left that views themselves as anti-war. We need to end the war as soon as possible. What do you want to say to them? I guess. I mean, I guess Tracy would sort of be aligned with that, but
Yeah, so one of the things that Michael Tracy and me talked about was always like, okay, like why are there no negotiations? Why are we not having negotiations? I actually just published a piece on my Substack this morning about, why doesn't Ukraine just make peace? And that's because the devil, as if a lot of these things is in the details, right? The Russian demands to end the war in Ukraine right now are that Ukraine withdraws from an enormous amount of extremely important strategic territory that it can't afford to lose, and that the Russians would then just use as a base from whence to attack Ukraine even further, And some people will be like, well, Ukraine maybe should have made peace in 2022 then. Yeah, I can kind of see the argument, but we're in 2025 now. We're 3 years down the line. That's not an option anymore, right? We have to.
that's also real quick. I was going to say that's a very good point because it's a realist argument from the Ukrainian viewpoint of why they can't allow this concession or that concession because it would be against their interests.
Yeah. So to give you one example, the Russians, they have the 4 annexed provinces: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk. And they're like, no, we're not going to stop on the current battle lines. We want all those oblasts in their original borders within Ukraine to be given over to us, right? I'll just go through how ridiculous that is a concession from the Ukrainian side. Donetsk, you're giving up the most strongly fortified Ukrainian defense line in the entire country. Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Kostiantynivka, Dobropilya, Seversk, Druzhkivka, right? Some really, really like large fortified cities. Also, a lot of the minerals that the US really wants are there as well. Zaporizhia, massive industrial city in the center of Ukraine with a population that hates the Russians, that has never even been controlled by Russia at any point during this war. Kherson, like, there's nobody in Moscow who has been like, for the last 10 years, my one dream is to get back the Russian beautiful city of Kherson. They want Odessa, right? Kherson is only useful as a staging point for Odessa. The reason that the Russians want the rest of these territories is because they are ideal staging points for another invasion in 5 or 10 years. And the Ukrainians who didn't fight for Crimea in 2014, because they were warned not to by NATO, Crimea was then used as a staging post for further incursions into Ukraine. And they worry that any territory they give up now will just be incursions for further on in the future.
Well, hey, I want to thank you again, Tom, for coming on Parallax Views. If there's anything else you want to add that I didn't mention, and also please promote your book. Let my listeners know how they can get it.
Yeah. So this is The Dogs of Mariupol. Now, if you're in the UK, it's in bookshops in the UK, like Waterstones, Foyles, Daunts. It's either there or you can order it. It's on Amazon. It will be released in the US. I guess most of your readers are US based. It will be based in the US. September the 9th. It's available to pre-order now. It's got a great cover. It's got pretty pictures from Bakhmut, and that's like a Ukrainian famous celebrity dog called Patron, who you get to meet in the book. It's got a lot of good stuff in there. I'm very pleased to be able to be putting forward what I think is a really good product. And I think it's a book that if you don't necessarily know that much about Ukraine, but you want a proper history of what's been going on over the last 3 years, I really recommend. I think that you're going to get what you're looking for out of it.
Thanks so much, Tom Mutch, for coming on Parallax Views.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me, JG. It's been a good conversation.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to
Galen, Matt,
Gunnar, Mark,
Simon,
Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia,
Jeremy,
Jeff,
WV,
John,
Bert,
Brian, Elliot,
Darko,
Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, JC, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.